You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our 2 episodes devoted to the Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, as we interview its translator, Dennis Washburn. In part 1, we learn about the legendary author and the historical period 1 millennium ago in which she wrote. Dennis Washburn gives us the literary and historical context for this sprawling work and describes the challenges of translating and abridging this long masterpiece. Washburn gives us the tools to approach the Tale of Genji and offers ideas for its relevance and familiarity, demystifying a work from such a distant historical period. Dennis Washburn is the Burlington Northern Foundation Professor of Asian Studies at Dartmouth College. He holds a Ph.D. in Japanese language and literature from Yale University and has authored and edited studies on a range of literary and cultural topics. For his achievements, he was awarded the Japan Foreign Minister's citation for promoting cross-cultural understanding. It is great to have him with us today. Dennis Washburn, welcome to the Norton Library podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're so happy to have you on to talk about Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji. And Dennis, this might be a new title for many of our listeners. Can we start with the author herself? Who was Murasaki Shikibu?
Murasaki Shikibu was a woman who was born into the middle ranks of the aristocracy in Japan in the late 10th century. So her date of birth is probably 973. We're not totally sure about that. We don't have a lot of birth records from that period. Certainly somewhere between 973 and 978. It's worth noting that her great-grandfather, a man named Fujiwara no Kanesuke, was an acclaimed poet, and so she came from a literary line in her family, but it was not one of the major governing lines of the Fujiwara family or that Fujiwara clan. It was a minor branch. Her father was a noted scholar of Chinese, which was really important to Murasaki's upbringing. But again, we know some of that sort of after the fact from her. A fragment of her diary, which was written somewhere in the first decade of the 11th century, probably between somewhere around 1003 or 4, and it stops at around 1010. So during that period, she was in the court. She served an empress, Shoshi, but she wasn't ever at the palace. She was at Fujiwara no Michinaga, who was the father of the empress, at his villa. And so we kind of know sort of the outlines of her life because of that diary, but we don't have a lot of extra sort of secondary material that can fill in a lot of the gaps. Her father was not a particularly successful politician. He was a provincial governor. He was appointed in the mid 980s to the Ministry of Ceremonials, the Shikibu, and that's where she gets her sobriquet. We don't really, she's from the Fujiwara family. We're not sure what her given name was. And her name Murasaki probably comes from one of the key characters, the ideal love of the protagonist Genji's life. She's teased about that, and she records those sorts of things in her diary. So what we know about her is backed up by some secondary, archival materials, but there are a lot of gaps, so it's difficult to say much about her personal life. The one thing I will say is that Richard Bowering did a translation. It's a lovely translation of her diary. And in the first part of that, it looks more like, say, Shonagon's The Pillow Book, in that it's these really kind of sometimes acerbic observations of court life, particularly the misbehavior of the men at the court. They tease her about her writing. They tease her about being like her character Murasaki, which is probably where her sobriquet came from. But at the same time, she does get very personal. And diary writing was an important emerging form in the late 900s. As a matter of fact, it helped shape the narrative structure of the Tale of Genji and the narrative style. And in her diary, she talks about how lonely she is. She married late. Her husband, Nobutaka, was kind of a cousin of hers. He died after only 2 years. She had one child. And the legend is that it was after his death that she went off into retreat near Lake Biwa. And that's where she got the inspiration for writing the Tale of Genji. But in that diary, I think the key thing is that we get some sort of a glimpse into her inner life. And she talks about herself, as I mentioned, as feeling very lonely at the court. And she also feels it's a strange mix of really strong pride, but also feeling like insignificant. I mean, there's a real tension there. And it's hard to say whether that's just a narrative, creation of diary writing. Sometimes it comes off as like adolescent angst in some strange way, but at least you get a sense of the tensions in her life and how she managed to overcome those to reach actually a fairly notable position at the court. She talks in the diary about sneaking off with the empress and reading Chinese text, heaven forbid. Women generally weren't expected to write that. And it was her erudition that was the source of a lot of the criticism, if you will, or the teasing that she suffered while she was at the court.
Dennis, you're using words like palace and empress
Sure.
and court. I wonder if you could put into some kind of context what the political situation, what the government of Japan in the 900s would have been like.
Okay, so this was a system that took several centuries to develop. You have to go back really to the 7th, 8th century, where you have a clan system. So you have a bunch of families essentially, hovering around the imperial clan. And the idea here, it's often described by historians, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's a useful cliche, as marriage politics. That was the clan structure. So what you needed to sort of promote, the welfare and the well-being of your clan and the political power of your clan was, proximity, literally proximity to the body of the emperor. Now that during the 7th, 8th, 9th century, you see this enormous influence from China, particularly from the Tang dynasty, which was an extraordinarily complex, really sort of proto-modern governing system. And so you have this overlay of a heavy but very rational bureaucracy over this clan system. And that's reflected in the structure of the palace. The palace that was eventually built around 794, what we call the Heian period. This Heian period was 794 to 1185, when the imperial structure fell apart and you have the first shogunate create a military clan start ruling. But it was a very successful system. It lasted more than 4 centuries. In any case, what you see in the palace, the actual layout of the palace, and this is obvious in the narrative itself, is all of these bureaucratic structures built around the inner palace, the deity. And in the inner palace is a kind of harem. You have young women from various different families that are competing for the attention of the emperor. And what that meant was that each of these women in their salon, they tried to gather, I would call them salon, not quite like the salons in Paris in the 19th century, but not so far off from that. So what you needed to do was get the attention of the emperor. You needed the emperor there. I'm putting this in pretty simplistic ways, but it was a kind of raw biopolitics. You needed the emperor there if you were to hope to produce, your daughter would produce an heir and a spare. Okay, and that was really crucial. So these salons that are all the way through this imperial was a kind of harem. And you needed women around your daughter, if you're, let's say you're a high-ranking nobleman, or even if you're a provincial governor, like Murasaki Shikibu's father was, you want your daughter into the palace, hopefully to catch, the eye of the emperor. But one way to do that is to make sure that it is a lively, aesthetically pleasing, attractive place to go.
Huh.
And you see that in certain parts of the story in the Tale of Genji itself, how important aesthetics were. But I think the thing I would stress here with regard to Murasaki Shikibu's own sort of position at the court is that this is, on one level, a political novel. Yeah, it's about aesthetics and beautiful, furnishings and sex and all of that. It's all about that. But that is driven by this unusual structure. We have a kind of hyper, almost proto-modern bureaucratic structure that encloses instead this older clan-based structure of political governance. And as a result of that, there's a lot of tension in the palace at all the time. There's a lot of intrigue all the time.
Yes, I'd like to get to the plot of the Tale of Genji in a second. Before I do, though, I'm wondering, was it unusual for a woman to be a writer at this point? Was she one of one? And is there a robust literature at this point in Japan?
There is very much a robust literature developing. Her book, The Tale of Genji, is, in some ways, it's a singularity. It's a leap forward from all of the developments that were taking place over really the 2 centuries leading up to her writing this in the early 11th century. But yes, there was a really robust tradition, and it comes together. I'm sort of wary of the genius explanation for why things come about, but there was a genius sort of writing this. But what you see is a collection of many of the sort of narrative forms were hybrid forms. So you would have poem tales. So you would have the sort of long tradition of poetry tied to, their stories would be written to explain or provide a context for poetry. I've mentioned diary literature, the Kagero diary, which was written in the 970s, was an extraordinarily influential work on all the writers, but particularly the women writers at the court. The thing that made this possible was that, and the reason that men tended to study Chinese because that was an official language, for court documents and the like. But the development of hiragana, the kana system, during this period, from let's say the early 800s or the 700s into the early 11th century, during that period, 2 kana syllabaries developed. Because there was no writing system in Japan before they adopted Chinese characters. And that made for an extraordinarily complex writing system if you use just Chinese characters. You can't tell which character you read for the meaning and which character you would read for just the sound. So what happens is priests start using parts of kanji, of Chinese characters, to mark out sounds in the Japanese language, the syllabic sounds of the Japanese language. The Japanese, I should mention, is totally different. It's an isolate. It has no connection to Sinitic languages at all. And so adopting that writing system was extraordinarily difficult. So the priests developed this katakana, which is still used today, mostly for foreign or loan words. And then the women picked up the hiragana, which were simplified writings, really simplified script of characters, but used only for the sound, so that you could use a character, meaning like to see, me would be read, but then to give the conjugations, the verbal conjugations, you would write those out in kana. So miru, to see, would have the kana do after it. And this sort of explains, I want to be careful not to overgeneralize here, because men also used hiragana. It was easier to write in the vernacular using that. But it was something that was really developed more by the women of the court. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but Kino Tsurayuki, who was the great editor, if you will, the compiler of the Kokinshu, the great poetry anthology of 905, in which her great-grandfather, by the way, Murasaki Shikibu, his poetry appears in that anthology. He was considered a poetic genius during that period. So there you have Kino Tsuruyuki, who is really at the heart of the court, but later in his life, he writes the Tosa Niki, but he pretends to write it in the voice of a woman. So there was an association, even if it was a man writing it, there was an association that this kind of literature written in the vernacular with hiragana was more associated with women. And it may explain why Japanese classical literature is probably, with a few exceptions, I don't want to overgeneralize, with a few exceptions, one of the few traditions that the classical canon is dominated by women writers. So the mother of Michitsuno with the Kagero Diary, Sei Shonagon with the Pillow Book, Murasaki Shikibu with the Tale of Genji.
Dennis, in your concentration on this novel and the language in your translation of it, is the manuscript extant that Murasaki worked on?
No. The provenance of the texts that we have now, that are the standard text, actually came together much later, almost 200 years later, which is unfortunate because during that period there was a lot of fan fiction. Her work was actually not, it wasn't like a bestseller like that, but it was actually pretty widely known by the 1030s, 1040s. You have in the Sarashina diary, the writer of that is talking about how her life is built around, she's like a fan of the Tale of Genji and her collecting all of the 50 some chapters. So early on, we have secondary evidence. That's not the only one, but we have secondary evidence that there were 50 some chapters. So we know that what we have now is roughly that. But it was put together, Fujiwara no Teika, a major poet in the late 1100s, early 1200s, started collecting these texts that were around and kind of put it together. It's kind of like putting the New Testament together. And that really wasn't put together until like 300 years after Jesus was preaching. So there is something to that. And so the provenance of the text is very complicated. The first 41 chapters, everyone agrees, is Murasaki Shikibu's work. The order in which these chapters were written, there's some uncertainty about that. But there seems to be a clear, by the time you get to the last chapter with Genji as a character, it holds together really very well. You can see there's an overarching authorial sort of presence all the way through, tying it together. Then there's a couple of chapters which I translated them. I don't believe they're hers. They're just really strange. It's chapters 43 and 44, but they're part of the canon now, so I translated them. They seem stylistically weird, and that could simply be because they were miscopied, or they could still be her work. The last chapters, the Uji chapters, about the last 10 chapters from 45 to 54, some people claim that was not written by Murasaki Shikibu. And that's been a debate that's gone on for a long time. Some people thought that her daughter, Ichigo no Ben, was the author of that. I don't accept that. My theory on this is Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation? And that is that as you read through her, for me, as I read through and was working through this as the translation, is that like any artist, she gets better as she goes along. And I do believe that the Uji chapters are a step even beyond the first 41 chapters. I think that in some ways that is, from a narrative point of view, from a literary artistic point of view, an extraordinary piece of writing. But I think she's the only one at the time that was doing this. It seems to me that if that's the simplest explanation, she wrote them all and she got better as she continued to compose the story.
For the Norton Library edition, you abridged the Tale of Genji, and it's already a fairly colossal piece of work.
That's right.
So how does that feel to say, no, this one is less relevant? What was your strategy?
So that was really painful because I feel like the structure of the early chapters is very episodic. All right. And yet as you move through the entirety of, I'll talk about just the first 41 chapters. As you move through that first section that deals with the life of Genji, it really starts to come together. And what you see is how careful she was in terms of her, um, the text is very intertextual. So she's borrowing not only from earlier Japanese stuff, she's borrowing heavily from Tang poetry, from Indic script, from Buddhist texts, histories, all of this stuff. So you have to kind of know that in addition to this very deep and rich poetic tradition that she's borrowing from, all the way through. So there's a care to the way she finally puts it together. It may have been put together more haphazardly, if you will, episodically at the beginning, but she clearly has an overarching sort of vision for that text. All right. But within that part, I think the part that I cut out the most, and I really, really struggled over it, was the text that dealt with the 20s and 30s, those chapters there, because those are dominated. Genji is now at his peak, if you will, in terms of his political power, his cultural power, all of these things. He's got all of his women together now at this place, the Rokujo Villa, which is like he should have been emperor, so he didn't, but he was demoted, and now he's got his own little palace. And that's the highlight of his career. But the story is dominated by two subplots, one dealing with his son, and the other dealing with the daughter of a lover who died early in the book. And he's brought her back, and she's come back to Kyoto after 20 years of absence. So those two subplots string through there. And I thought, okay, the best way to do this is pull that out, because the focus needs to be still on the arc that deals with Genji's life. So in the beginning of the book, the first 10 chapters, you have all of these different love affairs, one of which gets him into serious trouble. So first of all, Genji, his mother was beloved of the emperor. And in fact, the emperor, his father, falls so in love with her, he's really ignoring all the other women at the court. And that's a no. He's not playing by the rules of the game. Because in that structure I mentioned earlier about where you have this very rational bureaucracy, but at the core of it still is this clan system of governance, which really relies on relationships and marriage, sort of politics, marriage sort of diplomacy. And so for him to do that is not a good thing. And that's where you get the first major sort of intertextual move on Murasaki Shikibu's part. Basically, the story mirrors the historical story of the prize consort Yang Guifei. This was actually happened. Okay, and it is the subject of the the Tang period poet Bai Juyi, who's a major influence on her writing in the Song of Everlasting Sorrow. And eventually, Yang Guifei is murdered by her political rivals, even though she is the beloved of the emperor. So she takes that plot, and because the emperor, his father, Genji's father, is so enamored of his mother that this is causing real serious political problems. Genji has an older half brother, 3 years older, who's already been named the crown prince. But now Genji is being considered the favored son, so he's a political threat. And the emperor eventually recognizes this, and it's one of the reasons he demotes Genji to commoner status. That's why he has a name, Minamoto. Genji, that's the family name of Minamoto. So he actually demotes him to commoner status to protect him because he loves him so much. And he wants him to become part of the government, but Genji is beautiful, talented, artistic. He's everybody's ideal courtier, supposedly. So what happens after that is that his mother is hounded by the other women at the court, and I mean, it sounds like Mean Girls sort of thing, but she's hounded by the other women at the court, and it causes her to she breaks down, and her health fails her, and she dies. So Genji loses his mother when he's like 3 years old. Then in that opening chapter, the emperor who mourns the Genji's mother finds a substitute, a younger woman who comes from a higher background than Genji's mother. That's one of the problems Genji's mother faces. She's not from a distinguished lineage. She's from a lower level. She's sort of the level that Murasaki Shikibu was from, that level of aristocracy. And so he finds this woman. She's the spitting image of Genji's mother. And then Genji sort of finds that out. And so Fujitsubo becomes his sort of ideal woman. People want to interpret this as Oedipus complex. Let's not go there. That's not what's going on here. But that's what's happening. So that's the setup. Then you have a series of affairs, including eventually with Fujitsubo. And she gets pregnant with Genji's child. So the interesting setup in this first 5 chapters is that, I don't know how to put this. He's kind of hit the trifecta. He's cuckolded his father. Okay. He's committed a filial incest, not that. And she gives birth to a son who will eventually become emperor. So he's actually sort of disrupted the imperial succession. It is scandalous. It's really juicy. It's good.
As this is all being dramatized,
right?
Is Murasaki celebrating this system? Is she?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Criticizing it or just documenting it?
All three. I think there are contradictions at the court itself, in court culture. It did celebrate. They were powerful. They were beautiful people. They were the beautiful people at the time. It celebrated the artistic accomplishments of the court, the beauty of court life. All of these things were really crucial. The art and the literature, all of these things mattered to them. It seems funny to us now that literature and painting, all these things were so crucial because they had a political connection. Okay, I think most readers looking at this now would find that a little strange. But it remains this sort of political novel. But at the heart of that is this contradiction, because there's this Buddhist underpinning which says all of this is an illusion. The problems with the world is that we can't break away from our desires. It's the burning house, right? You have to somehow break away. And many of the courtiers in the book are always looking forward to the time when they can leave the court and sort of go off and sort of become monks or nuns or whatever. And this does happen with a number of the characters. Genji is always thinking of the day in which he will give up court life, but he never succeeds at doing it. So there's this contradiction there. So it's, on the one hand, the book itself celebrates that element of court society, but at the same time, it satirizes it. There is a critique of this all the way through. And in other ways, if you look at this as a really, how should I put this? A really well-developed kind of realistic writing that presages what's going to happen in Europe about 400 years later with Quixote, and then later in the 18th and 19th century, a kind of really strong, realistic writing. So part of it is she's world building, but with that world building comes both critique and celebration. So I think your question is really kind of right on the money there. I mean, this is one of the things I think that does make it a really great piece of literature, a groundbreaking work of literature globally, is that complexity, is that it does present the world as it is, but within that you see various things going on. Could I add a couple of other things about this early part of the book? I don't want to blather on about this.
I was going to actually ask you about chapter 1 and those early sections, please.
So a couple of things happen. In chapter 2, the key scene is this long scene, stylistically very different from chapter 1, where you have 4 young men. They're about 17. Genji's one of them, his friend Tono Chujo, and there are a couple of other young men that come in. And they're talking about women, okay, like young men will do, right? It's called the rainy night discussion, but it's kind of locker talk. They're talking about the women they know, and they're thinking about the ideal woman. So it kind of sets up where Genji is coming from. He's looking for an ideal woman. He has the idea of Fujitsubo in his mind, and beyond that, of course, the ghost of his mother. is hovering around. So that sort of sets off this chain of various different affairs that he has. And one of the things that you can see here, the sort of, I think that there are actually comedic elements of this. I would see them as comic elements. I'm not sure all readers would agree with this. But right after the rainy night discussion, he initiates an affair with a young woman. She's 20, but her husband is like in his 50s, 60s. He's he's a provincial governor, and he's a good looking guy, but he's old, right? And so he starts this affair, and he's using her younger brother as the go between to facilitate it. In the third chapter, the short chapter, he sneaks in to see this young wife again, but she hears him coming, and she wants no more to do. She wants nothing more to do with this affair because she's worried that his status is so much higher than her status, and she knows what happened to his mother, so she wants nothing to do with it. In the meantime, her stepdaughter, who is 16, not surprising given the age of her father, is in the same room and is asleep, and she sneaks off when she hears Genji creeping in. She sneaks off. Genji, in the dark, is feeling around and thinking, "Wait a minute, this isn't the right person." And then he sleeps. And then they have sex. He sleeps with her, and she's going, "Oh, well, I'm surprised to see you here, but it's okay." She's a quote unquote modern girl, and so and he just lies, a bald-faced lie, saying, "I've been trying to get to you for all this time." It's really strange, and it actually is sort of funny. And I think that the court reading this would have found this comic. I think most readers, when students now, if I have them read that chapter, they think, "What is he doing? What a creep!" And that's something that I think many modern readers are object to. And if they didn't, I would be worried about the modern reader if they weren't appalled.
This type of bawdy humor would have been celebrated in the court and
Sure.
at that time? No problem.
We have short stories after this that have similar kinds of stories. It's just the way it was. I mean,
it's like the Boccaccio episode we had, where it's just this type of humor.
That's right. And in some ways, people within the world of the story, people just sort of said, they excused it. I mean, he's Genji. He's this beautiful young man, and what are beautiful young men to do, right? One more example. The love of his life is Murasaki, and this is the one that really, really sends my students off the deep end. She is Fujitsubo's niece, and she looks like Fujitsubo. He sees her. Her mother has died, and her grandmother has taken her off to a temple in the northern part of just outside the city. And he sees her there, and she's 10 years old. And he eventually takes her under his wing and is training her to be his ideal wife. So this is usually interpreted, and actually with some reason, as grooming. He is sort of grooming her. But I have to try to walk my students off the ledge here. It's not quite that. You have to understand it within the context of what he's doing. Eventually, when his first wife dies in childbirth, and he gives birth to his son, his first wife dies. He then, soon after the mourning period is over, he marries Murasaki, and she's 14. And that really is interesting to see the reaction of students. Some of them don't, okay, fine. They get it that this was the year 1000 when this is happening. But others are really, really shocked. And again, I would, as I mentioned a minute ago, I would be appalled if they weren't appalled. On the other hand, when I'm teaching this, I remind them, what the age of consent is in a lot of the states in this country? It's very young. So that's of course a holdover of much older practices. So they need to not lose their values. Okay, I want them to hold on to my students and my readers to hold on to their values, but they have to also kind of step back and look at their own, not at the historical position. They have to look at their own position. Why am I reading it this way? And I'm not, they as I said, they should be appalled, but they need to think about, well, why would this be appalling and not at the time? And if they think about that, this is one way to sort of critically consider their own values? Where is their reading habit coming from? What's their historical position? How do they react to the text? And I do this. I'm going to be honest with you, just to go back to something I mentioned a minute ago. I do think this is a great work of literary art. But a lot of people, I've seen the reaction to it, which is not. I'm not disappointed in that. I find it natural. So I just don't like the story itself. Well, I don't know. If you took that attitude to Crime and Punishment, I don't think anybody is really sympathizing with Raskolnikov. I mean, I don't think that's what's going on there. You can still see the brilliance of the writing, and I think some of this is comic. A lot of it's political. The historical situation. People died very young. That's why people married at 14. But even if you take all of that account, I don't want the reader to give up their values. I want them to be conscious of that as understanding their own practices of reading, because those practices of reading are what guided Murasaki Shikibu when she was writing. She had her own sort of set of standards that she was going to bring into creating this world that she creates.
Dennis Washburn, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu.
Thank you very much.
The Norton Library edition of The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, translated, abridged, and introduced by Dennis Washburn, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.